Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Trumais Perik Aleph Halacha Beis. We're starting today Mamish on top of Daf Yud. The whole daf today is going to refer back to the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel that we had in the Mishnah. So let's quickly review. The Mishnah writes, let's begin with the halacha with Beis Hillel, that when you separate Truma, guys, let's become familiar with the words, from a davar shaloi nigmar malachtoi. In the case of the Mishnah was olives that were harvested to make them into oil, to be used for olive oil. The olives are not a finished product. If someone separated truma from the non-finished product for both itself and for oil, says Beis Hillel, the whole separation is ineffective. Now, what did we explain yesterday? Why is it ineffective? So really, there are two steps to this. Step number one is that separating the davar shaloi nigmar malachtoi for the oil, which is a finished product, that's something that you shouldn't do. Not only shouldn't you do it, but as we will see, midrabanan, it's not effective. And now, step number two, since the separation from the olives for the oil is rabbinically going to be ineffective, we'll explain in a moment why. Therefore, we don't even allow the separation from the olives for the olives to be effective, because if that were to happen, then right away you would have chulin, and truma mixed together from the outset. Why would that be? Because the part that you separated from the olives for the olives would be effective. Not only would it be effective, but since truma doesn't have to be a precise amount, midairaisa, one little exempts the whole pile from it being teveled from truma, since none of it is going to work for the oil, as we'll explain, so then we would have said that all of the olives are rectified. All of the, not only the olives in the pile, the olives in your hand, the olives that you were intending to make truma gedola for the oil, since it's ineffective, therefore it goes back to being tevel, but the olives that are being separated for the olives would have or should resolve all of the olives, which would mean that at the end of the day, some of the olives that you have in your hand would be truma, the ones that were separated for the olives. You got it? The remaining olives that you intended to use to separate for the oil that's ineffective will be chulin, because it would be rectified from the olives. And the Beis Hillel does not allow for you to have from the outset a mixture of chulin and truma of dimua. Okay, now we have to explain that that's how the Gemara began, that we're going to have a Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel. On Daf Yud Gimel, even though the Mishnah writes these rules that you should not separate truma, mi davar shaloi nigmar malachtoi, for a davar shenigmar malachtoi, you shouldn't do it. But the Mishnah says if you did it post facto, it's valid. So the whole Beis Hillel doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't post facto the separation from the olives for the oil be effective? It should be effective b'di'eved. So the words that they go. So the words that the Gemara, it's a kasha on both. Beis Shammai also holds that part is ineffective. Mipnei gezel hashevet, because if it would be effective, you're stealing from the tribe of the Kohanim. What does it mean you're stealing from the tribe of the Kohanim? So yesterday we learned one interpretation, and today the way we will learn the Gemara, we're going to have two more interpretations. What we learned yesterday is that if we would allow it to be effective, then the kohen, instead of getting oil for truma, what would he get? He would get olives. This would demand for the kohen to have to trouble himself with very laborious work to make the olives into oil. The Chachamim felt it's not fair. In the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel, even though the Gemara wasn't so happy with it, there, as an example, we're speaking about someone giving rice that was not yet removed from their hulls. So the kohen has to do a little bit of work to remove it from the hulls. Even taking the chaff out of the kernels, which is a bit more work, still bearable, b'di'eved. But to tell the kohen you have to make olives into oil, that is something that demands so much work that the Chachamim said, even post facto, it's ineffective. Don't forget, Beis Shammai also holds, Aviv, that olives for the oil is ineffective. Beis Shammai just says, okay, but the olives for the olives, davar shaloi nigmana malachtoi, lid davar shaloi nigmana malachtoi is effective. Shouldn't have done it, but it is effective. So therefore, you have this mixture. So some of it is truma, some of it is chula. We're going to begin today's daf by understanding another interpretation in the words mipnei gezel hashevet. There's going to be, very interestingly, a lot of discussion b'shitas beishamai. A lot of discussion b'shitas beishamai. Even though normally, since we don't paskin like beishamai, most times the Gemara doesn't even speak about beishamai. We will have that over here. We're going to introduce a couple of new dinim that we never had yet, even though we know it from the Rambam. Like as an example, that truma gedoyla has to be separated min hamukov. Min hamukaf means min hasamochloi, which means that at least lachatchila, maybe even b'di'evet, you have to separate truma only for something that's nearby the truma. Let me just explain this b'kitzur in our words of introduction. Meiser has to be mei eser. It has to be exact, 10%. Right? The Mishnah writes, al tarbela aser umadois. You don't give meiser by approximation. It has to be precise. Truma, in contrast, is not allowed to be given precise. It's given by estimation. But we still want for the estimation to be close. And since the Chachamim said that the average person should give 2%, 1 from 50, the only way you can approximate 1 from 50 is if everything is nearby. Because if I'm taking from here for here and from another place, or as we'll see in the case in our Gemara, if I have figs and olives, or figs and grapes, whatever the example of the Gemara is, mixed together, it's very hard to approximate how much of it is figs, how much is grapes. So you're not going to give the right approximate 2%. So you shouldn't take off truma, and perhaps, according to some, even b'di'evet, even though min hamukaf, the Rambam says is a din of lechatchila. We will see in our Gemara that it can even be a b'di'evet. And therefore, since the explanation that we gave is the explanation, the whole problem of min hamukaf is only by truma gedoyla that's given by estimation. Trumas meiser min hameiser, which is also like truma gedoyla, even though we learned throughout already the couple of few daf over here that we compare all of the trumais together, not for this halacha. Meiser min hameiser does not have to be min hamukaf, because you can only give it if you measured it prior. You know exactly how much you have to give. I don't care if it's not nearby. But we're going to have a third explanation of the words gezel hashevet, and finally, I hope to get there, we're going to see that according to the Tana Rabbi Yosi, he cannot have the girsa in our Mishnah at all. According to the Tana Rabbi Yosi, Beis Hillel says something else, which is gevaldik. And with that, we're going to conclude the daf. But let's begin. So guys, remember, there are 2 steps. Step number 1 is, Bein le Beis Shammai, Bein le Beis Hillel. I'm happy about it. According to both of them, even b'di'evet, the olives for the oil are not effective. Beis Shammai says, okay, but the olives for the olives are effective. So we have a mixture. Beis Hillel says, no. Since the olives for the oils, midrabanan, is not effective, it's amazing the koyach of the rabbanan. Don't forget, truma is a biblical halacha. It's amazing that you did something. Biblically, it's valid. The chachamim have the power to invalidate it, to say it's ineffective. But since that part is ineffective, since we don't want for the more to happen from the get-go, so they say the whole thing is ineffective. Even the olives, for that, which means everything is still tevel. That is Beis Hillel. Now, why isn't olives for oil gezel hashevet? So yesterday, again, because it's a lot of work. Daf Yud on the top. Rav Mana loy omar kain. Rav Mana didn't explain the meaning of the words gezel hashevet the way we explained it in explanation number 1, but he gives explanation number 2. And he writes like this: Elom shehu mevakesh litrem lefi shemen. You want to give approximate 2%. Problem is that when you have oil and you let's say you have 100 sa. Aviv, how much is 2% of 100 sa? 2 sa. You don't give it exact. You're not using your measuring cup. But people, not me, I don't know how to do it, but many people, like the Rabbi, people that understand how to make food, they'll get more or less 2%. They'll get more or less 2%. Oil for oil. When you are taking olives for oil, that means you have to remove olives that will produce 2 sa of oil. The Marafulda writes that you need 4 sa of olives to get 2 sa of oil. In other words, it's so difficult to remove the right amount, the probability will be that you're going to remove 2 saw of olives. You might even remove 3 saw of olives. But you're not going to have the 2% of oil. Those olives will become diminished in volume when you make them into oil. You get it? So you're not going to give the right amount. But Gewaldig. Now, that answers the question, because on the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel, when the Mishnah says that post facto it's effective, of course, the case of the Mishnah will be, let's say, simple. You have kernels. You did not yet smooth the pile. Okay, I get it. You're not up. It's not yet. It's a davar shaloi nigmar malachli, but it's kernels. So when you approximate 2% from the pile for truma, makes no difference whether you smooth the pile or not. You got it? The proportion has nothing to do with the gemar malacha. In our case, it has everything to do with it, because you're going to get too little. Again, it's amazing, because midai raisa doesn't matter if you give too little. But since the Chachamim want you to give, even if you're stingy, 1 of 60, they don't want you to give less than that. So they therefore, even post facto, they don't allow it to happen. That's the Gavaldik. So now the Gemara has a question. If that's the reason, what will be the case if you have someone who understands that from olives to oil, there's a big loss, who understands what the Marafulda says, that you have to give approximately 4 saw of olives to get from that 2 saw of olive oil? If someone knows that, and they separated the right amount, what are you going to say then? It's also ineffective. The guy gave the right amount. Haga Atzmacha asks the Gemara, if that's the reason, what happens? If someone got the quantity correct, if he got the proportions correct. So the Gemara says, again, there are 2 ways of learning it, that there's one answer, that there are 2 answers, but we're going to read it one way. Kedoin Avad Kain answers the Gemara, even if someone knows how to get the right amount, he might have only gotten the right amount this time. Zman Choyron, remember in the Yerushalmi, you have to add an aleph. Many times the aleph is silent. Acher, right? Another time, Le'avad Kain. The same guy himself, next time, if we will allow it to happen once, he might do it again. And when he does it again, he might forget that you have to give a lot more olives to get a much smaller amount of oil. Furthermore, V'loi oid, according to our version, there's 2 answers. The Pnei Moshe only has 1 answer. We're learning like the Marafulda. Even if you get it right this time, you might have gotten it right. Your friend is seeing what you're doing. Your friend will do the same thing. Your friend won't know that you took 4 saw to get 2 saw. Your friend will chami means to see you. And you know what he'll say? You know why this guy is taking 4 saw of olives? Because he wants to give a lot of truma to the coin, which you are allowed to do. You are allowed to give more than the 2%. Actually, as long as you leave something to remain chulin, from which to remove the ma'aser rishon, as long as you did it in 1 step, not in 2 steps. I can't give truma and then add to the truma. Too late. But if I give it in 1 go, you can give more than the 2%. Someone will observe you. They're going to think you're giving more than what you need, which is not true. You're giving exactly what's needed, right? You're really giving what will become 2%. The guy doesn't know it. But the observer will say, okay, you want to give 4 saw. I want to give the normal. I'm only going to give 2 saw of olives in the place of 2 saw of oil. And to prevent that from happening, the Chachamim have the koyach to say that olives for oil, even b'diavad is not good. So we have 2 answers so far in the meaning of the words gezel hashevet. And like we explained already, the next step is already simple. In other words, what we said now was really both Rabbi Shammai and Beis Hillel. Olives for oil, midrabanan doesn't work. The only question is, will you allow now olives for olives? Beis Hillel says, since this doesn't work, we don't want that to work, not to have dimua. But before we get to that, again, it's interesting that we're going to have a discussion, b'shitas Beis Shammai, which is, says the Gemara, Chizkiya Amar, guys, we're learning now the shita of Beis Shammai. What does Beis Shammai say? It does rectify the olives. Le'omru elazeisim al hashemen or va'anovim al hayayin. When Beis Shammai says it works, it's only in the case of the Mishnah. Olives for olives, grapes for grapes. We'll see soon what he means. Ha sha'ar kol hadvarim. Now these words are cryptic. And again, everyone over here, not everyone, there are so many different ways of learning the Gemara. We're learning it not necessarily the way it fits the most in the words, But that's what we're going to learn it. Shar kol advarim means in the opposite direction. That's the way we will learn it. The opposite direction means what happens if you give from the oil for the olives. What happens if you separate from the oil for the olives and the oil? So the oil for the olives is not going to be truma. The oil for the olives won't even be truma midoiraisa. Because there's no chiyuv of separating it. And you're not giving from it. Here, Beis Shammai will hold.
But there is on the oil.
There is on the oil. Correct.
So why wouldn't he say the same thing, that at least the oil on the oil?
One second, let me finish talking. Here, Beis Shammai will hold, like Beis Hillel in our Girsa, that since the oil for the olives is ineffective and you're doing it all together, even the oil for the oil will also be ineffective. Gewaldig.
But in this case, you're doing something even better for the Kohen. He's getting something that's finished and something that could be finished also. Means you're doing something nicer for him. It's not gezel.
So we are only beginning the sugya. So let me just say this, Kevin. The fact is that if I separate truma from a davar shaloi nigmar malachtai for itself, even though I wasn't chayiv to do it, post facto, in many cases, it's effective. But if I'm separating truma from davar shenigmar malachtai for something shaloi nigmar malachtai, it won't even be effective. It's not effective at all.
No, but there is a question as to why it wouldn't be effective for itself, following what Beis Shammai said before.
The second step makes sense. In other words, when you separate in our Mishnah, guys, halkop, we should have started earlier. When you separate olives for oil, since midoiraisa, according to everyone, it's effective. B'di'evet, that's the Mishnah and Daf Yud Gimel. It's only the gezel hashevet, but since midoiraisa, it's effective. So even though midrabanan, that part is not effective, Beis Shammai allows the other part of your statement to work. But if you do one separation, oil for oil and for olives, wine for wine and for grapes, since the part for the olives is not even effective, midoiraisa, Beis Shammai will be moedes, says Chizkiah, that none of it will be effective. However, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, I disagree with you. Why? Once we see from our Mishnah that Beis Shammai allows for a part to work, it's al derech, the sugya of palgin and dibura, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo yishanya, he zeisim al Hashem al anavim, or anavim al yain, he shar kol advarim, the way we're learning it in the opposite direction. I disagree with you, which is what you guys are arguing. Okay, the oil for the olives doesn't work, but the oil for the oil will work. Weiter. Now let's come back to our Mishnah. And again, we are continuing to learn the Gemara all according to Beis Shammai. Our case, you're separating from the olives, for the olives and the oil. For the oil, it doesn't work. Gezel HaShevet. Beis Shammai says, okay, but the olives, for the olives, do work. Says the Gemara, Havraya b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, va'afilu alasar. Va'afilu alasar means that you might have thought that the portion designated as truma for the olives will remain tevel until you separate truma for the oil. Even though it works, but still this guy wanted to separate olives also for the oil. So Beis Shammai says it works. One might have thought, when it works, when you separate oil for oil, then what you did right now will go into effect together. That's what you might have thought. So they say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, no, that the pshat is the way we learned it, which is that even though the olives for the oil is ineffective, the olives for the olives is effective right away. So alasar doesn't mean so much makam, it means man. Right away it's effective. Furthermore, Rab Chananya, in the name of Ravimi, in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, again, all in Beishamai, Divrei Beishamai. Again, the case of our Mishnah, not where he argued with Chizkiah. When you separate it, guys, you're good. Olives for olives and for the oil. Now this is very important. One might have thought, let's read what one might have thought in the last marafulda of the Amid. Don't say that that truma is atzman yesh bahen, that part of what you did is effective. The olives are effective. You know what you might have thought? Let me just give you numbers, guys. Let's say you took in your hand, I'm just giving numbers, 100 olives. And in the pile, there's another 1,000. So Beishamai says, and you said that this is for olives and for the oil. One might have thought that you know what's rectified? 2 olives in your hand becomes truma for the other 98 olives in your hand. But that which is not in your hand, one might have thought is not rectified at all. Don't forget, the oil is not in your hand. Your desire of using what's in your hand to rectify the oil, everyone holds is ineffective. Beishamai says, no, olives for olives are effective. So he needed to say, B'Shem Rabbi Yechanan, one might have thought, again in the Marafulda, that Kigoyin should be a Meyazesim, just say that you picked up 100 olives, and which means you might have thought that, you know what Beishamai means, there is Truma. It means that 2 in your hand are Truma, for the other 98 in your hand, that becomes chulin. That's what you might have thought, but that's not what he's saying. What Beishamai means is Ella af al oisam shalamata shigbia elu. You have 100 in your hand. I'm giving you numbers. You have another 1,000 in a pile, and you have oil, So it doesn't work on the oil. But what we do say is that the total of what's in your hand and in the bottom, whatever 2% of that is, that it becomes truma, and everything else becomes chulin. Mehen hevu oisam shebeyadei truma, and ve'im nisha'aru lamatam shiyu elu truma aleim gam kein hakoil mesukan. Everything becomes rectified. This is very important. All of the olives become rectified. And this is also important to clarify something we learned yesterday. This guy intended for what's in his hand to be for both olives and the oil. Now, how much would be for the olives, how much for the oil? Whatever is necessary. 2% of the olives and another 2% of the oil. Now that it doesn't work for the oil, we're going to say that whatever is needed, whatever will be 2% for all of the olives in your hand and in the bottom, that amount is truma in your hand. And everything and all of the other olives are chulin. That's why I said, let Rabbi Silel, what really you have now is you don't know which is where. Which is why you have dimua from the outset. That's the problem here. You're going to have a mixture because part of what's in your hand is truma. Part of what's in your hand is chulin. You don't have a ratio 100 to 1. Even in the case where you have 100 olives in your hand, and even if 2 would be for the other 98, again, you don't have the ratio of 100 against 1. You have 98 to 2. It's very good. So that's statement number 1. Chananya, b'shem Ravim, and b'shem Rab Chizkiah. Now, the Gemara says, because we're going to have 2 statements. Rab Chananya Savar Meimar, another, we're going good. Daf Yudam and base. You guys were good, yeah? Every line is a bomb over here. Rab Chananya Savar Meimar. That when do we say, I agree with what Rabbi Yechanan is saying, that according to Beishamai, when you separate it, we don't say only what's in your hand is rectified. Only what's in your hand is rectified. What's in the pile is tevel. We don't say that. We say that what's in your hand becomes truma for what's in your hand and for what's in the pile under your hand. That's only if biminoi. That's only if what's under your hand is only olives. But if what's under your hand is olives and figs, that's the example the Marafulda gives. That's the min hamukaf issue. Since you can't see when there's a mixture of olives and grapes. Olives and dates. That's the example. That olives and figs. I'm sorry. That's the example that Manafullah gives. You don't see the quantity, so you have no idea what would be the approximate 2% of what's in the pile because it's all mixed together. Then nothing in the pile is rectified, but what's in your hand will be rectified. Even if you have in your hand olives and figs mixed together, since it's in your hand, you have the technical min hamukaf requirement. Min hamukaf means that when you separate truma, that which becomes truma and the remaining has to all be in close proximity. Close proximity also demands for there not to be a mixture of two different types together, even if it's in close proximity. But if it's in your hand, somehow the hand makes it min hamukaf. These are new dinim that we are learning right now. Look inside the top maraful. I know it's late, but because we just introduced this new din. Right, the second maraful, all the way on top. Biminoi. Biminoi means it's its own type. She'ein kan element echad. I agree that everything becomes tithed, all of the olives, only if all of the olives in your hand and in the pile, that's the key, is only olives. And if you have not only olives, but olives and figs, even if what you have in your hand is also a mixture, and what you will have in your hand, all of the olives in your hand will become chulin from truma gedoyla. Clear, we said gavaldik, and all of that is because of min hamukaf. So the hand somehow resolves the min hamukaf, even though there's a mixture of olives and figs. But if you want to use that which is in your hand to also, just the olives, you're not talking about the figs, you're only separating from the olives in your hand, you wanted to do it for all of the olives in your hand and in the pile, says Rab Chananya, for the pile it won't work. It will work for your hand. Amalei Rab Ze'edam. Now Rab Ze'eda, according to the way we are learning, is not making a comment on this Rab Chananya right now. He's not making a comment on Rabbi Yochanan right now. But he's going to the first statement, which is very good. The statement that we just learned, that the olives in your hand is effective for your hand and for the pile underneath your hand if it's only olives. Don't accept this opinion. Don't accept this opinion. What I will say is, when you said harezu, this is truma, nifter mashu biyadoi. What is in your hand becomes rectified. Guys, how many do you have in your hand? 100. Rab Ze'eda, for some reason, assumes that the separation for what's in your hand and for the pile is affected in two stages. That's the way he assumed. What would the two stages be? First, 2 in my hand rectify the other 98 in my hand. And also, step number 2 is whatever is in my hand should also become truma for the pile underneath it. Chevra chulin can never be used to rectify truma. Can never. Only tevel can become truma, which will rectify the chulin. Once something was already trumad, now it's chulin, that can never be used to separate truma for something else that's tevel. Chulin cannot be used to separate for tevel. So Rab Ze'eda is challenging Rab Chananya. What do you mean? Because it was Rab Chananya, right? Rab Chananya b'shem Rav Imi b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. That's why it's Rab Chananya. He says, how can it work? How can it work? Since he understood that Rab Chananya sees it working in 2 stages, it's too late for it to work.
Question.
Yes.
Sorry. Question. So is the separation additive or separate? Meaning, do you take off? You have 100 in your hand. You took off 2. Okay, now you have theoretically 98 in your hand. So do you count 100 against what's on the floor, or do you count just the 98?
No. What? Let's say what's on the floor is another 100, Vlad. So how much do you need to separate from what's on the floor?
Another 2.
Really, it's not true. It's really 2 points. We're going to get to that another time.
Well, I understand.
Okay, but okay. So in other words, so instead of saying Rab Ze'eda understood, first 2 comes truma for the 98, and then another 2 in your hand from the chulin becomes for the pile underneath it. It's too late. If it were to work that way, it's too late. Why? Because the 2 in the 98, all of the 98 is chulin. None of the 98 could be used to be mesak and tevel. Very good. Since nifta masha b'yadai.
Yeah, but 1 second. Can I push back on that for a second?
Quickly, yes.
This whole 2%, that's not an actual biblical amount. You could have a fraction that would take care of it. So what? So the fact that you don't have another 2% or whatever the amount that you need, who cares? I have 2%. It takes care of my hand.
I'll tell you,
it also takes
Danny,
care of the pile.
Because let's say, even by biblical law, let's say a person doesn't have to give any percent, and he's choosing to give 1% or 0.5%. You have to give truma gedola from that which is tevel. Anything that's chulin can never be used as truma. That's the issue for other tevel. So it's not about the percent. Since Rab Ze'eda understood Rab Chananya b'shem Rav Imi b'shem Rabbi Yechanan that it works even mashal amata, but in 2 stages, it can't work in 2 stages. Since nifta masha b'yadai, which means what the other 98 in your hand is chulin, so the chulin, poitren es hatevel, none of the 98 can work. So the Gemara now is countering Rab Ze'eda, the way we're learning. Amar Rab Chananya b'rei de Rabbi Hillel, to Rab Ze'eda's objection, you misunderstood Chananya b'shem Ravimi b'shem Rabbi Yechanan. He is not saying that it works in 2 stages. No, ka'achas, it works in 1 stage. Mikiven she'amar hareizu, all together. Niftar masha b'yodei v'niftar masha l'matan. So in my example, if there's 100 in your hand and there's 100 in the pile underneath it, Aviv, how much should be the approximate? Approximate 4 olives. Right away, 4 olives in your hand become designated as truma to rectify what's in your hand and what's under your hand. Okay. Now, Amar Rabbi Chanina. We're going now back to what we learned here on top of the Amid, the second teaching, that if you have in the pile a mixture of the example the Marafulda gave, olives and figs, then your separation will only be effective for that which is in your hand. Your separation will not be effective, all according to Beis Shammai. Don't forget, according to Beis Hillel, none of it. For the pile, because you lack min amukov. So Amar Rabbi Chanina, that nidin hadvarim, the whole din that even b'di'eved, if it's not min amukov, it's not effective. That's only betruma gedoyla shehitzricha litre min amukov. Like we explained in the words of introduction. Why do we have to give truma? Why is it that when we make a truma separation, we want for everything that will be rectified to be in the close proximity? Min amukaf means min hasamuch loy. It has to be samuch, because you're not giving exact, but you want to give it a close approximation. For you to approximate, you have to see what is, and if it's a mixture, you're going to get confused. But when it comes to trumas meiser, that you have to give exact, since tzricha shetehei mitzum tzemes, either b'mida or b'mishkol or b'minyan. By the way, when we say you have to give 10%, how do you measure it? Is it a measure? Is it a weight? Is it a number? It depends. Every item, the way you transact that item. So if the common way of selling eggs is by giving it by the number, by the dozens, so then 10% would be, I'm saying that because sometimes you have 100 eggs. Example, you have 100 eggs. I don't want to speak about eggs by tithing because we don't tithe eggs. Forget about eggs. You have 100 apples. Yeah. When you give 10 apples, is it 10%? Well, depends. If you are counting the apples, you gave exactly 10%. But if it's about the weight, what you think 10 apples will be exact 10%, maybe the apples that you gave were very little and the other apples are bigger. We had that a few masechtos ago. So just another detail, that what type of measure do you use when you separate either Meiser to the Levi, or when the Levi separates, or B'di'evet or Lachatchila, the Yisrael separates himself, that the Meiser, Min HaMeiser, whatever, either Midah or Mishkal or Minyan, since over there we give exact, I don't care if it's not Min HaMukav. Beautiful. Weiter. Now, all of this began by contradicting our Mishnah, right, to the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel. Our Mishnah writes, Bein Lebi Shammai, Bein Lebi Hillel, that olives for oil, even b'di'evet, is not effective. And the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel says that if you give midavar shaloi nigman amalachtoi, lid davar shenigman amalachtoi, b'di'evet, it is okay. Guys, don't forget that Mishnah. Now we're introducing today another Mishnah. This is really a gavaldik exciting. Also here in this topic, Tamon Taninon, we're going to learn soon in our pagination of Daf Tezayin, says the Holy Mishnah, Ein Tormin Minatame Yalator. We already know this. That if you have two piles, one is Tahar, one is Tameh. What can a kohen do with Truma Tameya? What does he do, Kalev? You're not allowed to eat Truma that's Tameh. It's not Asur Bahana. You can benefit from it. How would you benefit from it? You use it as fuel. You can burn it, not to destroy it, like chametz. Chametz we burn because we may not benefit, right? Truma Tameya, if you're a kohen and you want to warm up your soup and you need to have fuel, they don't have gas. They use stuff. You can use it, but it has a lot less value. So you're not allowed to give Truma from Tameh for Tahar. Okay? And I want you to know, interestingly, that's a din derabanan. Now, what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says that if you did so, bishoigeg, again, the Gemara is all mekatzer here. What happens if you did it bishoigeg, which means you did not know that the produce is tamei? Since midoiraisa it is effective, it's only the chachamim that said, it's not right. You're wronging the kohen. Okay, but if it was bishoigeg, then post facto it's effective. But the chachamim say that if you knew it's tamei, then it will not be effective. So says the Mishnah. Very nice. Rabbeinu HaKadosh didn't always quote all of the Tanaim in the Mishnah, but we know that there was a Tana quoted in a Braisa that argues with the Mishnah. Tani b'shem Rabbi Yosei. There's one step that I want to do over here. I want to go back. I'm sorry. Before the Mishnah Daf Tezayin, the Rash Shadilio, this is Gavaldik. When I saw this, yes, the Rash Shadilio says that the last din that we just learned, that only Truma Gedoyla has to be min Amukov. That Truma Smeiser does not need to be min Amukov. He writes Gavaldik. He writes that this is a third answer. How did we begin the sugya? And Daf Yud Gimel, it says that b'diavad min davar shaloi nigmar malachtoi lidavar shenigmar malachtoi. Daf Yud Gimel, the Mishnah says it's good. Says that Ashadilio, that's because the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel is speaking about Trumas Meiser. No, he's making the whole case of the Mishnah that you had olives and figs mixed together. Look at this genius. And this guy took out from the olives and the figs, which means he has in his hands olives and figs. And he's saying, I want the olives to rectify the olives and to rectify the oil. And Daf Yud Gimel, it says post facto, it's effective. He says, I'll tell you why it's effective. It's effective because over there, the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel is speaking about Meiser min ha-Meiser. By Meiser min ha-Meiser, we don't eat min ha-Mukov. Our Mishnah is speaking about Truma Gedoyla. Since it's about Truma Gedoyla, that's the word of our Mishnah. Since it's about Truma Gedoyla, our Mishnah is speaking about whether it works for what's underneath it. Since there's a mixture and which makes it Shaloi Min HaMukav, that's why even with the Ever it's not effective. I'm just putting it out there. So according to the Rashidilio, there are three answers. Okay, let me come back over here. So we're quoting a Mishnah on Daf Tezai. The Mishnah writes that B'shoigig Mezit. Tane Rabbi Yosi, the Tane Rabbi Yosi holds, no, he makes no such difference. That ve'im toirim min hatamei al hatoir bein b'shogeg bein b'mezit, he argues with the chachamim. He holds masha asui asui. Okay, in other words, that what would be the din? I just want to tell you another din. Are you allowed to separate truma from inferior to superior? What do you think? Same idea. Midoraisa you could. Midarabanan you cannot. Because it's not right? You have apples. Some of them are superior, some of them are inferior. Imagine you have 100 of each. You're going to take 4 apples from the inferior and say, this is for both piles. You should not do it. But b'di'eved, it's effective. B'di'eved, it's effective. Rabbi Yosi equates the problem of tamei alatar to inferior and superior. Okay. Now, why are we bringing this in over here? This will be the ending of today, the completion of today. Says the Gemara, Ma Omar Rabbi Yosi Hachi. According to Rabbi Yosi's understanding, he allows b'di'eved's a lot more. post facto it's okay. We are saying over here, Uma im I tamon. In the case of the tummy products, shekuloi hefsid like Kohanim, that if you were to allow even bemazed for your separation to be effective, as does Rabbi Yossi, which means the Kohen is getting the worst of the worst. He's getting something that none of it can be used. All of what he's getting has to be burned. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yossi says, Masha asui asui. So when it comes over here, the understanding of Rabbi Yossi goes to the Gezel Hashevet, the first one that we learned yesterday. That what's the problem? Why isn't the olives effective for the oil? Because you're making the Kohen Nebuch do a lot of work. Doesn't make sense. To say that because of that, the Chachamim say that even b'di'evet it's not effective, it doesn't make sense. If the Chachamim allow b'di'evet for the Kohen to receive Tomei Truma, that he can't use at all, getting Tomei Truma is a lot worse than getting olives, even though you have to do a laborious work to make it into oil. Turning to the Daf Aleph on the top, like Kohanim, is like Kolchrein, that it should be valid post facto according to Rabbi Yossi. So think about the whole thing now. I'm happy we have a minute. What was the whole Mishnah? Guys, this is a good sikum over here. The Mishnah is predicated on two steps. Step number one is that you separated olives for olives and for the oil. Step number one is we're saying, the olives for the oil doesn't work. The way we learned until now is that's true, both according to Beis Hillel and according to Beis Shammai. Done. The question is now, will you at least allow the olives to work for the olives? So in our girsa, we said that's the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. That's the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says, yeah, either is a dimua, zolzain. Beis Hillel says, no, we don't allow dimua from the outset. All of that is based on the fact that olives for the oil is ineffective. Says our Gemara, Rabbi Yossi did not have that in his girsa at all. The whole thing is wrong. According to Rabbi Yossi, not only is the olives for the olives effective b'di'eved, the olives for the oil is effective. Because since Rabbi Yossi cannot argue with Beis Hillel. No one argues with Beis Hillel. Since Beis Hillel says that even Tomei al hatoid b'di'eved is okay, the Kohanim get nothing of value. So for sure, olives for oil is avada okay. Okay, so the Kohen has to do work. So it must be that Rabbi Yossi did not have our girsa. He didn't have this machlokes. So the whole Mishnah collapses according to Rabbi Yossi. So now we have a third opinion, that if you separate olives for olives and oil, everything is effective. And with that, we'll stop. And